Hi there. So it's been a couple of years since the 9th generation of consoles entered the market with the release of both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X/S in late 2020. However, the transition between generations is slow, and the roughly 22 million units that have been sold by September last year are dwarfed in comparison to the 176 million consoles sold by their forerunners as of May 2022. Not to mention the 122 million Wii U and Switch consoles that Nintendo had sold by March of this year. Now of course, this will slowly change as 9th generation consoles become more affordable and more people seek to replace or update their hardware. And importantly, very few games, if any, are still being developed for the PS4 or Xbox One without also working towards a 9th generation release. So why am I starting a video with all of these boring numbers? Well, because this all means that we've reached the end of what I would deem 8th generation games. Games that are exclusively or primarily designed for the 8th generation of consoles, and we can therefore review elements such as the progression of video games in that time, or the arguments over the greatest console of the era. But this video isn't about either of those topics, instead existing because I recently replayed a game that I don't think gets nearly enough attention in the debate surrounding the best AAA game of the 8th generation. So, first things first, some housekeeping. This video is obviously all about my opinion, and I'm very happy to hear other ideas and arguments regarding your thoughts on the matter, so please do comment away and I'll make sure to get back to you. Be warned though, I'm only considering games that were initially released for 8th generation consoles, not games that were released for other platforms and then later happened to pop up on the PS4 or whatever. Along those lines, I'm also not including remasters such as Mass Effect's Legendary Edition or Gears Ultimate or The Last of Us Remastered, but remakes that entirely rewrite the experience of the original game are allowed. A good example of one of those would be 2019's Resident Evil 2, which, believe it or not, is not the first sequel to 1996 hit title Resident Evil. That's right folks, you heard it here first. I should also let you know that I may refer to Dishonored 2 as Dishonored at times, but you should be able to tell through context whether or not I'm referring to the first game. Furthermore, there will inherently be spoilers ahead for the first game and some for Dishonored 2, although I will warn you in advance when I'm about to discuss the endings, and you'll be able to skip that section using the timestamps in the video description below. Alright, so with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at Dishonored 2. Dishonored 2 takes place in the fictional steampunk world in 1852. 15 years earlier, during the events of the first game, Dunwall, the capital city of the Empire of the Isles, was decimated by a disease known simply as the Rat Plague. Meanwhile, the Empress was assassinated and the Royal Protector, player character Corvo Attano, found himself framed for her murder. Over the course of the game, you reinstate her daughter, also scandalously your daughter, Emily Coldwin as the new Empress, having found and defeated those who wronged you, thus restoring your name and the legitimacy of the throne. 15 years later, as the second game begins, Emily is still ruling as the Empress, and the plague has gone, but new problems are troubling the Isles. At the beginning of the game, a woman named Delilah appears, claiming to be the rightful Empress before killing your allies and usurping your power in a coup that leaves you a fugitive in your own kingdom. You choose to either retake control of Corvo, fighting once again to clear his name and eliminate a new threat to the throne, or to play as Emily, discovering the dark side of her empire as she uses the skills that her father taught her in order to regain her position as the head of state, treading a similar path to that which Corvo did 15 years beforehand. And that's not the only way in which Dishonored 2 picks up where its precursor left off. The first game won the adulation of fans and critics alike, and was praised for a multitude of qualities that Dishonored 2 replicates, and in some ways improves upon, to prove itself as a great sequel to a great game, thus suggesting that it betters Dishonored, despite that game's recognised elite status. So now we embark on the first of 5 major chains of thought that lead me to my conclusion at the end of the video, catchily named Part 1, the first of 5 major chains of thought that lead me to my conclusion at the end of the video, the first of the 2 sections where I compare it to the first game. Or POTF OFM COTT LMTM CATEOTV TFOTTSWICTTFG for short. One of the key attributes that the first Dishonored was adored for was the quality of its environmental storytelling, which took place in a world that felt thoroughly considered down to every last detail, allowing it to seem organic and, cliché warning, lived in because of the depth of its design. The victims of the rat plague and the murders taking place, including those committed by us, therefore felt like real people, which benefited the morality system that determined the game's ending based upon how many people you killed, as otherwise it might feel arbitrary, such as in the similar title Bioshock, where, bewaring spoilers for the next 15 seconds, killing just one of the girls in order to harvest their superpower-inducing resources, or even just to put them out of their monstrous misery, is the difference between raising them all as a loving father and taking over the entire world with a nuclear arsenal. No, Dishonored endings actually make sense, especially given that they spawn from such measurable causes as the choices that you make about Corvo's character and the decay that spawns from the death that you leave in your wake. There is a tangible connection between the player's actions and the story's outcomes, which is in large part due to the successes of the world building that take place in the dark corners of Dunwall. And Dishonored 2 offers more of this on both the minute scale and the grand stage that is the setting of each mission. In fact, whereas the first game was criticised for the fact that it didn't provide enough of Dunwall for players who appreciated such elements as the stellar environmental storytelling, Dishonored 2's journey through the Empire creates a rich tapestry that allows us to appreciate the destitution and decay of an empire whose leaders are tied up in bureaucratic ceremonies and meaningless formalities that have rendered the Isles stagnant and enabled the rot to set in. Throughout the stages of our quest, we visit such scenes as high society dinners, scientists' solariums, witch-infested libraries, mad inventors' mansions, black market vendors, dust-riddled street wars, and even a world between worlds in which dark magic and mischievous gods reside, away from time, death, and the laws of physics themselves. And each of these locations offers not only variety, but also a chance to see into the world over which Emily rules, offering stories through lore and discoverable diary entries, but also through overheard conversations and the mumblings of disgruntled guards, alongside the rooms that tell entire tales by themselves, making me feel like Detective Bunk Moreland every time I finally figure out what happened in some bloodied backroom at the edge of the map.
Motherfucker.
What's more, this level of detail isn't solely relevant to those who understand the in-depth story and lore of the first game, as Dishonored 2 does a really great job of condensing the stories of the past through methods such as voiceover, the musings of the magic heart that points you to points of interest, and of course the written and spoken logs that lie in wait in every other room, meaning that new players know enough to immerse themselves in this world, whilst those familiar with the events of Dishonored can find its stories and locations littered throughout the Empire. Inevitably, the level of thought that's gone into the environmental storytelling of each level, which creates areas that are far more dynamic and richer with fiction than a straight path through each of them would have you believe, will adorn each playthrough with the cherry on top that is the extra level of quality that comes from finding yourself immersed in the world of a game. And the increased variety in the second game as we travel to the far reaches of the Isles surely only contributes further to the enhancing qualities of this key element. The first game was also praised for its unique and striking visual style, with which it distanced itself from more lifelike contemporaries, whilst also corroborating the dark and Dickensian aspects of its world and story. And the aforementioned variety of settings in the second game means that this factor is out in full force, making for a memorable voyage across the seas of the Empire as we are treated to remarkable images of all kinds. From the bloody gutters of Karnaka's grimmest scenes to the not so humble abodes of the wealthiest men in the Empire, the game's aesthetics are shown off over and over, fully leaning into the hyper-stylized nature of each setting in order to deliver a world that is thoroughly enriched by its beauty. Whether in the dusty ruggedness of Batista or the Victorian futurism of Jindosh's home, the second game manages to do what many would have thought impossible prior to its release. It manages to out-style Dishonored. And another major compliment directed at the first entry was that its gameplay lent itself to players who wanted to face naturally generated and incorporated puzzles, considered by Tom Higgins of The Telegraph to be a great example of thinking man's games that cherish player choice and control. There are very few hints by comparison to other games, instead offering players various methods by which to solve the problems that each level poses, and having numerous solutions prepared so that whichever route they take in their inevitable experimentation, they can discover for themselves a way to bypass the challenges that the mission contains, rather than being spoon-fed simple solutions or confined to a couple of predetermined routes that restrict what can be done with the array of abilities on offer. And speaking of, Dishonored 2 has far more of these, boasting 67 powers and enhancements across the two-player characters, rather than the 10 that were available in the prior game. This means that the litany of methods for completing each level, such a point of praise when it comes to the first game, is doubled in the sequel, which presents an unrivaled number of methods for progression, truly outperforming its antecedent as a playground for those who seek to craft their own path in a medium that so often restricts the allegedly infinite choices on the part of the player. Furthermore, the first game was praised for its variety, which allows players to return to the game over and over and draw something different from it each time. Dishonored 2 expands upon this not only through the increased amount of variety in gameplay, but also through offering two-player characters, Corvo and Emily, with different stories and abilities to discover and contrasting emotional journeys across the Empire. Through allowing you to choose whether to play as the first game's protagonist, Corvo Attano, or his daughter and protege, the usurped Empress Emily Coldwin, the game gives you a chance of how you embrace it emotionally as a continuation of the characters and events of the first title. Either you are Corvo, older and more grizzled, once again returning to the shadows in yet another bid to restore the rightful leader, all the while knowing that you failed to protect your family for a second time and that you might not be able to survive a third, whilst also either upholding your morality by refusing to kill or finally giving up on your pacifist ways and spiralling into a life of death and destruction. Or you are Emily, following in the footsteps of a father who taught you in the ways of the methods that he used in the first game, whilst discovering the poverty, death and other conditions affecting your empire, now that you've finally been knocked down from your ivory tower and have to walk the Dickensian streets of steampunk cities, either showing Corvo's successes as a father through choosing to conduct your affairs non-lethally, or showing his failures by succumbing to the ways of a killer. And those are just the possibilities that arise when you play through the first game without killing anyone. You then have to consider that Dishonored 2's gameplay interacts closely with the story and its developments, and that there's so much choice inherent within the gameplay. Not just through the different powers allocated to each character, or the factors of chaos that emerge from your decisions surrounding the lethality of your methods, but also the choices offered regarding whether or not you want to stay hidden in the shadows or brawl with your enemies, and if you want to remain entirely human, or accept the outsider's mark in exchange for superhuman abilities. And if you do accept those, then there are so many different paths that you can take. Add to that the bone charms that alter the game in small but significant ways, leading to you playing it differently as you make the most out of the powers at hand, and the fact that you can craft those bone charms with over 400,000 possible combinations, and what you get is a game that can be played millions of times without ever once having the same experience, significantly improving upon those options that players had in the first title, and allowing you to craft and fine-tune your experience to a degree that I'm not sure I've seen in other AAA games before or since, even in those of a similar genre such as Bioshock or Prey. Hopefully it's clear by now that the second game builds upon the strengths of the prior title, which is relevant despite the fact that the first game came out in the 7th generation, because we can use Dishonored 2's closest comparison, the much beloved Dishonored, to indicate that the sequel is something very, very special. However, I suppose you could argue that if these minor enhancements were all that it took for Dishonored 2 to build upon its predecessor, then surely the first game did all of the groundwork and any sequel to Dishonored was always going to be brilliant. And can you really call a game that's basically pre-made the best of its generation? Well no, of course not, but it certainly wasn't pre-made. Otherwise, the series' third game, Death of the Outsider, wouldn't have been quite so utterly forgettable. No, Dishonored 2 definitely had work to do, as, whilst Dishonored may have felt like a breath of fresh air, it definitely had its problems, and in a sequel that's several times bigger than the original, and with much more to do across its larger, sprawling levels, those issues would only be magnified. So it's lucky that Dishonored 2 also fulfills another requirement for any truly brilliant successor, which is to amend the most prominent criticisms of its predecessor. That's right, it's part 2, the second of 5 major chains of thought that leads me to my conclusion at the end of the video, the second of the 2 sections where I compare it to the first game. You see, the first game struggled in a number of ways, not least of which were the troubles with its storytelling. Many viewed the story as just a chain of admittedly memorable but thematically and emotionally disconnected chapters with no real narrative drive, suffering in particular due to an unfortunate lack of escalation in key aspects such as the tension of the game, the difficulty of the missions, and the overall sense of scale, which combined, or perhaps failed to combine, to deliver a somewhat abrupt ending. And whilst Dishonored 2 follows the same basic structure as the first game, even sharing the same number of missions in total, it differs as there is a very definite rising action that builds to a climactic finale. This is perhaps aided by the latter stage's increased challenge that comes from the introduction of new enemies designed to overcome what we have learned about choking out guards, or hiding in the shadows, or whatever it is that we're doing at this point to survive. Furthermore, we are given a very definite list of enemies well in advance of the finale, so we are aware of how close we are to the final confrontation, which obviously creates a sense of foreboding that looms ever nearer as the story draws to a close. Dishonored the First was also hit with some criticisms over the AI, in particular the dim-witted guards and the inconsistency of their detection abilities. Some wouldn't notice if you strolled straight past them, whilst others were eagle-eyed enemies able to spot a spy a mile away. This meant that stealth playthroughs were unreliable, as doing the exact same thing twice in a row could end up with entirely different results, so players who were relying upon successful stealth infiltrations could be punished even when they were doing nothing wrong. This was especially troublesome for players whose character and abilities were built around stealth, as they could end up forced into combat that they were simply not equipped for. Interestingly, one of the ways that Dishonored 2 addresses the issue is to make stealth more difficult for those seeking to stick to the shadows. Players can now be detected whilst leaning out of cover, which wasn't possible in the first game, and the AI feels much more sophisticated, having been rebuilt from scratch so that any enemy, whilst operating independently thanks to its own artificial intelligence, is also under the command of a puppet master AI, which allows them to fulfill more complex tasks and roles than those in the previous entry. In response, the player has a wider array of abilities that can benefit stealth playthroughs, allowing them to create a supernaturally covert character that facilitates a more manageable stealth playthrough, whilst still posing a contest between the player and the enemy AI. And for those who decline to accept the mark of the outsider and the steampunk powers that came with it, well, you were probably anticipating a challenge anyway, right? Furthermore, the first game's artificial unintelligence was somewhat further amended through the variety of enemies present in the game. The existence and persistence of overseers, bloodflies, wolfhounds, clockwork soldiers, witches, bloodbriars, nest keepers, gravehounds, and gang members, among others, means that there is no one way to outsmart every enemy, and pushes players into adapting to the hostile presence in each level. All of this together results in a more complex but equally more rewarding experience, meaning that players can't simply decide to stick to one simple and easy strategy for the duration of Dishonored 2, and therefore that the game and its fans were constantly pushing one another to new levels of ingenuity in a way that even most great games would struggle to achieve. This fix also applies to the complaints that the original's flexibility was something of a downfall that prevented players from exploring their abilities and the corners of the world laid out before them. They can no longer just blink their way across every single mission until they've finished the game, so each level forces them to rethink their strategy as they find themselves unable to pacify clockwork soldiers, or to stay away from the witches who can teleport to the location of every detected movement. It is a playground with many more possibilities than others in the genre, but which is also able to ask challenging questions of every available playstyle, which is a combination that I don't think I've ever encountered anywhere else, at least not as comprehensively as this. And whilst some saw the first game as punishing players for engaging in some of the options that were offered to them, particularly as the difficulty was increased in the latter stages of violent playthroughs, those similar playthroughs in the second game also allow those players to unlock more devastating abilities, levelling the playing field so that every game is manageable and there is no right or wrong way to play Dishonored 2, a game in which every style is just as valid and just as enjoyable as the next. Despite, the morality system. But then again, you can't expect Emily to execute every member of society that she comes across and then have a happy ending as a much-loved and benevolent ruler, can you? Something that really stands out as a key component of the successes of Dishonored 2, to the extent where it really deserves its own section, is its level design. Because whilst I've already given a quick overview of the qualities of its environmental storytelling, there's so much more to how the physical, explorable world that's been created for this game benefits the player's experience. A huge part of Dishonored 2 is how large and how open its levels are, giving players these big chunks of city to explore, where they're discovering not only the in-depth history of each district, its rulers and the people who live there, but also secret paths and black market shops and open windows that lead to bloodfly-infested rooms that allow you to bypass difficult security measures. Due to the variety inherent in each player's experience, it's difficult to pin down exactly what makes Dishonored's level design so naturally functional, but it probably helps that they spent so much time designing the settings so that they would be explicable, practical cutouts of a larger operational world. In one interview with PC Gamer, director Harvey Smith stated that they tried to avoid something they called the Deus Ex effect, named after fellow immersive sim series Deus Ex, in which the locations feel designed with nothing but gaming in mind, meaning that there would be these giant traversable vents in places that made no sense in the context of the fictional world, but which allow players to bypass sections of a level, therefore feeling like an inauthentic and gimmicky method of progression. As such, it's only through exploring the levels and, for instance, finding someone else's diary entries or overhearing whispered conversations that you'll discover most of the routes to hidden runes, or the tools necessary to complete specific tasks within the context of the mission. They all seem rather realistic. A window left ajar to combat the sweltering heat of Psychonos, or a building being quarantined to combat the spread of infestation, meaning that the experience of uncovering these helpful little secrets feels realistic, as though you've actually achieved something. What's more, the ability to play through the game 2 or 3 or 7 times and still utilise different routes and abilities means that the game requires and rewards genuine decision making on the part of the player, rather than simply herding every player down the same path like mindless sheep, or having set courses for stealthy players and violent players, which offers no real choice beyond the initial decision of how you want to advance through the game. I've lost count of the number of times in other games where you're about to enter a room full of enemies and the only options are A, go in guns blazing, or B, take the vent that is conspicuously placed right next to the door. So it's really nice to play Dishonored and find that it's so much more open than that. And it's no coincidence that this is realised to the greatest degree in both of the most praised of Dishonored 2's 10 outstanding levels, the Clockwork Mansion and A Crack in the Slab. The Clockwork Mansion is the 4th level of Dishonored 2 and requires you to complete 2 main objectives. Find a way to eliminate Kirin Jindosh, a brilliant inventor who was involved in the coup that saw you lose your place on the throne, and rescue Anton Sokolov, the genius who assisted Corvo in the first game and whom Jindosh has since captured and imprisoned. There's a short section in the streets of Karnaca where it seems that this mission isn't going to be all that different from the last 3, before we arrive at the mansion in question, where everything is turned on its head in spectacular style. The level is the first time in actual gameplay that we come up against the Clockwork Soldiers, towering inhuman enemies that were briefly seen at the beginning of the game, and which are harder, better, faster, stronger than their flawed human counterparts. They can also see directly behind them, meaning that it's much more difficult to sneak past, and Jindosh alerts them to your presence after confronting you about your mission and warning you that he likes to dissect any interlopers. The player therefore has to adapt how they play to rise to the challenge posed by these new machines, whilst also avoiding traps that shoot lightning bolts into anybody that gets too close, and circumventing the standard human enemies who behave differently to the robotic monsters patrolling the place. Jindosh also taunts you as you make your way through his home, able to detect you as you step into new areas no matter how stealthy you are. Well, unless you manage to entirely avoid his watchful gaze to begin with, as in typical Dishonored fashion, you can eliminate him without him ever knowing that you are there. And even with those added factors, we haven't yet reached the kicker. The reason that this mission is so highly regarded and why it's named what it is. Because the title doesn't refer to the Clockwork Soldiers, as intimidating as they are, but to the mansion itself, where each of the already impressive rooms is designed to drastically change upon the flick of a switch, shifting until the space is something entirely new, a redesigned room that offers myriad new opportunities to the player, whilst also gifting them with the chance to sneak through the spaces behind the shifting walls, creeping past pursuers and into new areas like an ant crawling through the clockwork. This incredibly complex level design, which turns cliffs into bridges and prisons into mazes and even whole rooms into elevators, effectively triples the already almost infinite ways of completing the mission, all the while challenging the player to navigate convoluted environments that are jam-packed with deadly foes. The Clockwork Mansion takes the greatest strength of the Dishonored series and makes it its own, blowing it up to unthinkable proportions and then handing it back to us gift-wrapped as a stunning journey through the mind of a mad genius. And, through entirely different means, A Crack in the Slab does something very similar. A Crack in the Slab is the 7th mission in Dishonored 2, in which we visit the decrepit halls of the decaying manor where the mad mining baron Aramis Stilton resides. We break in order to eliminate Aramis and discover what we can about a ritual that was performed here 3 years earlier. Upon arriving, we find that there's nothing we can do. To kill Stilton now would solve nothing, as the man is insane and has done his damage already. But then the outsider, the devious god who gifted you your superpowers at the beginning of the game, emerges again and manifests a steampunk time machine of sorts to allow you to hop back and forth between 1852, when the second game is set, and the extravagant party 3 years prior at which Delilah Copperspoon, the game's main villain, performed the dark ritual that made her immortal. Through appearing and taking actions in 49, we are able to bypass the obstacles and barricades that block our path in 52, and vice versa, as well as affecting the course of history, even to such a degree that we can turn the old house from the rotting, crumbling setting that we show up to find, into a fully staffed and well-maintained mansion in which the fanciest folk of all the Isles wouldn't look out of place. With our powers taken away, we can only rely upon our ingenuity to lead us through perils both past and present. Yet again, we are forced to change how we play, solving new kinds of puzzles and making new kinds of decisions, such as which enemies to face, as we settle into deciding how the world around us operates rather than how we operate within said world. We make our way through a web of ever-revolving timelines, hoping to come out on the other side with the answers and the outcome that we need, as well as maybe a few bonuses, such as the loot that can be attained by placing a dead dog in a furnace so that its body can't play host to the parasitic bugs that make it impossible to reach a safe 3 years down the line. It's not the Clockwork Mansion, which has to be traversed with the skills and abilities that we've accumulated up until that point, and in which we change the room layouts to bypass the threats posed by our enemies, as we are instead thrown in at the deep end with a complete lack of powers and tasked with changing the threats of the environment in order to accommodate our need to bypass the obstacles presented to us by the room layouts, if that makes sense. Both levels employ completely different methods, but both end up achieving the same thing, gifting players the option to change the world around them as they seek to overcome the increase in difficulty through unlocking one of the many paths available to them, resulting in a stellar level that still sticks in the mind 6 years after Dishonored 2 was released. And each level also stands as testament to the fact that the game has distinguished itself from so many others in the genre, not to mention in the wider world of AAA games. In most titles with RPG elements, TM, you can specialise in one type of gameplay, say lurking in the shadows and only emerging to knock guards unconscious, and that will carry you through the entire game. Whereas in Dishonored, the different levels and enemies are built from the ground up with such differing premises that you constantly have to find new ways to progress, which actually gives you the freedom to take the game in whichever direction you please at any given point in the narrative. Once more, Dishonored manages to offer unparalleled freedoms to the player, bolstering one of its greatest assets in its bid to become the best AAA game of the 8th generation. Of course, not everyone came to the conclusion that Dishonored 2 is some perfect masterpiece unrivaled by the rest of AAA gaming. Although it was very well received by most fans and reviewers, the game was undoubtedly subject to a number of criticisms. Somewhat alike the first in the series, Dishonored 2 took some flack for the arc of its main story, which some claimed was underdeveloped by comparison to the rich subplots present in each of the game's missions. However, as I've already stated in comparing the first two Dishonored games, I felt that the sequel's story was greatly improved by a few key factors. Without giving too much away, there is a clear focus upon the main targets and how the wider story is going to pan out, as well as helpfully unambiguous distinctions of the fundamental story elements of exposition, rising action, climax, and denouement. As such, we are tethered at once to the end of the game and our character's final goal, meaning that there is an inherent building of tension that serves the story and our investment to it, whilst also understanding the nature of the story and where we are at that exact moment, which enables an easy relation to the protagonist and the position in which they find themselves. Despite these visible factors, the story is not too transparent, as it is gifted opacity through the layers of reasoning and character that are stacked upon each action. For instance, having voiced protagonists, a departure from the first game, gives us a window into the mind of Emily or Corvo, particularly at the start of each mission when we are offered insights that tie the smaller narratives into one cohesive being. Furthermore, our actions make sense each time as the only available options with the intel that we have, progressing logically from the panic of being usurped in the surprise coup to the formidable and steady position that we have earned for ourselves by the end of the game, allowing us a chance at eliminating the once immortal Delilah who sits on our throne and enacts a reign of terror. Alright, I'm going to mark this point as the start of a new section, even though I'm still talking about story, because there are some spoilers for the ending that I'm about to unleash upon you all. Quick reminder that you can skip ahead using the chapters in the description if you don't want to hear about the ending. So what I'm talking about with the endings is just how well they managed to cap off the pre-existing story elements and how we interacted with them throughout the game. In the more optimistic low chaos ending, achieved through killing as few folk as possible, we rescue the other protagonist, the one we didn't play as, and Emily is reinstated upon her throne. Using what she's learnt either through her time exploring the Empire and or through her upbringing and advising at the hands of Corvo Attano, she sets about repairing the Isles, not only in response to the damage done by Delilah, but also to ameliorate the issues faced by the impoverished and diseased in the far reaches of the Empire, usually dominated by the political powers of Dunwall. Meanwhile, the less optimistic high chaos ending, achieved through killing large numbers of people, just proves even further what I was saying about Emily living out Corvo's teachings, as if you play as Corvo and wind up with the high chaos ending, and if she is freed from her prison of stone, she shall end up ruling a brutal reign with an iron fist, embodying our choices and demonstrating that she represents the path that we have set Corvo on, and the legacy that his decisions have created. The conclusion to either path tells a great story about Corvo's character and the trajectory of his arc through the way that his personality has imprinted itself upon his daughter, which is something that I think is so often ignored in the assessments of the story that conclude that it offers less than it should. Alright, no more spoilers from here on out. Needless to say, I think that these criticisms are somewhat unwarranted and, if anything, highlight the improvements in the narrative that took place between the first game and the second. And I feel a similar way about criticisms of the character development in Dishonored 2, which really does as much as it can do given that your character can range from a regular person in hiding, doing their best not to harm anyone or anything, to a murderous psychopath using the powers of a malevolent god to unleash carnage upon the innocent folk of their empire. Understandably, it's impossible to project any uniform character development upon this figure. However, the interactions between the player character and the world that they occupy, which changes according to the gameplay decisions that you make, mean that there's a clear trajectory established in response to how you act, which is made clearer as you explore the world and uncover the interactions in question. Furthermore, the endings reflect your decisions in a manner that ultimately feeds back into your character, suggesting that much of the displeasure surrounding the development of a character is due to falling on the wrong end of the chaos system, or simply charging from objective to objective in a way that negates the quality of the world building and level design. What Dishonored manages is to give us a realistic insight into the changes of an empress forced to experience the poverty of her empire, and a royal protector who has to return to the place where he was once a member of the working class. Given that the events of the game take place over roughly 1.5 months and are almost entirely dependent upon the whims of the player, there's very little in the way of development that we can expect to experience that we don't actually get. I mean, how much have you changed as a person over the past 40 or so days? realistically, I'm more or less the same. Another aspect of the game that came under fire from a few was the perceived absence of intensifying challenges throughout, which I think flies in the face of the aforementioned facts that there are newer, tougher enemies introduced at multiple stages in the story, and missions that force you to adapt to difficult circumstances, such as having your powers taken away for the duration of a crack in the slab. We start the game with our enemies leaving us alone in a room with a bunch of windows that we can escape from, which I'm guessing was inspired by Ted Bundy's not-so-daring escape in 1977. And that's how lenient the opening is. It's comparable to 1970s police work. And by the end of the story, we're coming up against a coordinated and mechanized military controlled by powerful witches who answer to an immortal demon able to trap us in paintings of her own creation. Add to that the increased difficulty from the first game, and I'm not sure it's fair to have a go at Dishonored 2 for something that I felt it actually does rather well, somehow providing us with difficult situations whilst also giving us limitless ways of surpassing them. And this is especially true when considering that the title was also on the wrong end of some criticisms regarding the limitation of mechanics, such as when our abilities are taken away from us or negated by the introduction of new enemies. This is a huge part of how the game manages to introduce new trials and force us to improvise, brilliantly requiring us to come up with new ways around each issue as the tactics and playstyle that we're just about coming to terms with are instantaneously whisked away. Without these moments, there would be very little in the way of obstacles for the player, and the game would become a breeze after we'd accumulated enough runes and bone charms to upgrade ourselves to the point of functional immortality. These restrictions are necessary to provide the player with a worthwhile experience, which would otherwise go out of the window as every semblance of a challenge was eradicated from the title, meaning that the withholding and rewarding dynamic that is a huge part of why people enjoy video games would be gone, in favour of an entirely narrative-driven experience, which is just not what Dishonored exists for. Also, Dishonored 2 was disparaged over how it ran on PC, which required patches to fix. But PC is not an 8th generation console, so And finally, some people saw the absence of a New Game Plus option as a serious misstep, but there actually is a New Game Plus.
So jot that down.
I'm not trying to argue that any critique of Dishonored 2 is invalid or somehow irrelevant, because that would be a ridiculous position to try and take. However, I do think that a lot of the key points of criticism are founded upon ideas of what games of other genres should be, and therefore are perhaps not perfectly attuned to what it is that games like Dishonored 2 are seeking to achieve. Adding that to the fact that a lot of the logic behind their negative discourse seems flawed at fundamental junctures, I believe that Dishonored 2 deserves more love than it gets, and that some of the things that others didn't enjoy about the game are elements that I would consider its greatest strengths. Now that we have painted a thorough picture of Dishonored 2, it's only fair to take a look at some of the competitors for the title of the best AAA game of the 8th generation. Obviously, I can't go into them all in anywhere near as much depth as I have Dishonored 2, nor can I take any kind of serious look at more than just a few of its closest rivals, but I've tried to use games that typify the strengths of the strongest of their genre, or whichever other category that they could reasonably be sorted into, in order to cover as wide a range of titles as possible. The first game that I think could be considered a serious challenger is the technical and storytelling marvel that is Red Dead Redemption 2. The density of its world, brilliance of its overarching story, and tragedy of Arthur Morgan and the Van der Linde gang all combine to create a vivid world in the vibrant cultural image of the dying days of the Wild West. The atmosphere and cinematic qualities of the game are truly something to behold, and the top quality writing keeps players invested throughout the entirety of its 60 to 80 hour main story. Not to mention the dozens of side quests and unique encounters that fill the map and make it feel so much more dynamic than the settings of many other titles in the open world genre. There's also a stark difference between Red Dead 2 and the original game, which serves to showcase the technological leaps that had been made between the latter stages of the 7th generation and the penultimate year of the 8th. However, what Red Dead doesn't offer its players is choice, even with its honor system and the 4 available endings, as no matter how we play through the title, we end up constrained by the fact that it's a prequel, meaning that all 4 outcomes result in the exact same situation, and all of the work that Arthur does in this game, and everything that he, and we, strive for, is wholly negated during the events of its chronological successor. No spoilers here, but if you're aware of what happens at the end of the first game, then hopefully you'll understand what I mean. The length of Red Dead 2 is certainly not unjustified, but undoubtedly requires an investment that a lot of players simply cannot make, and across the 100 or 200 hours that it might take someone to make it to the ending, they're likely to notice that, no matter how much there is to do in the world itself, the actual quests are often rather repetitive, resulting in what some might experience as a fatigue and see as a lack of replayability that simply isn't the case with Dishonored, where the sheer amount of gameplay-focused decision-making means that you can play through the game, or even individual missions, 6 or 7 times while still drawing something new from each playthrough. Next up on my list of 8th generation AAA games is Doom Eternal. The latest entry in the series that made first-person shooters what they are today, Doom Eternal is an incredible blend of testosterone with the intellectual stimulation that video games can offer.
Is this allowed?
Played at a blistering pace and delivering an unrivaled power fantasy while still proving challenging to its players, Doom Eternal is perhaps the pinnacle of its genre, and its slightly cartoonish but smooth visuals make the most of the improved technical capacities of the PS4 and Xbox One. Throw in arguably Mick Gordon's most impressive soundtrack and a few arcade elements to play on our nostalgia for a time before microtransactions, and what do you know, you've got a fantastic FPS on your hands. Unfortunately though, there are a few weak points in its otherwise impenetrable armour. The exploration in Doom is a lot of fun, but it certainly doesn't boast the storytelling strengths of the discoveries of Dishonored, and can resort to somewhat dull platforming at times, which removes a lot of the pace that the best Doom games are known and loved for. The increased focus on storytelling was also a tad irritating at times, as it meant that the flow of the game, which is so unimpeded in Doom 2016 for instance, stuttered and stumbled to accommodate a narrative that most Doom players could not care less about. As with all of the games that I'm nominating here, I think that it's phenomenal, so please don't get me wrong, but I also don't see it as a likely usurper to the tale of the Cold Ones fighting to regain their throne. So, I've done a third-person open-world game, I've done an FPS, and now it's time for a Soulsborne-ish thing. Sekiro is an incredibly difficult game, at least for feckless, incompetent, bumbling half-wits like myself, that offers fluid yet fast-paced combat with an emphasis on making the right decision within a fraction of a second, 4,000 times in a row before you can save your progress. That's not a great way to sell it, but the fact of the matter is, a lot of gaming is dependent upon failure and the rewarding feeling of your eventual success, which is magnified in multitudes when the game is as relentlessly unforgiving as something like Sekiro. And on top of that refined combat and difficulty, we get levels of verticality and exploration that are unheard of in other games in the genre, and which offer players a great number of options on how they choose to progress, which only fuses with the unrivaled swordplay to give us a game far more complete and pointed in its complexities than some of those other titles that everyone always compares tough games to. But Sekiro isn't perfect. Its imposing difficulty can become overwhelming if you're stuck on a particular section, forced to repeat it again and again until you've lost all hope of ever making it to the next chapter of the story. A level of inaccessibility that makes it difficult for someone who is bad at these types of games, and who knows a lot of people who are bad at these types of games, to consider it the greatest of its era. There's also a lack of player interaction, which is a feature of other titles of the same kind, meaning that you're missing out on both the community and competitive elements that those games offer. Furthermore, there's a lack of character interaction and meaningful dialogue, which can turn Sekiro into a lonely experience that I'm not personally such a fan of, which is very subjective, but which exacerbates each of the somewhat less subjective elements that I have mentioned, resulting in an isolating game that can offer you very little if you get on its bad side. You're probably a little surprised to see Battlefield 1 here, but let me explain. One of the key components of modern video games is the online element, which Dishonored 2 lacks entirely. Battlefield 1 does not. In fact, up to 64 players can play at once in any given game, creating utter mayhem as each side twists and bends to accommodate the wishes and whims of 32 individuals, all of whom can fly planes, drive tanks, ride horses, and occupy artillery, as well as snipe enemies, mow down foes with heavy weaponry, and even inject adrenaline to revive their fallen comrades. Never before or since has there been such an impressive realization of a largely destructible online playground, which also happens to be on fire and screaming at you in German. Battlefield 1 made the most of the 8th generation to create an interactive image of warfare like no other, and hit incredible heights with its immersive multiplayer battlefields and unprecedented levels of chaos that the series has been desperately clamouring for ever since. Its stories are also a nice touch, each offering an entirely different experience that wasn't burdened by the need to be related to the others, meaning that each could focus on one key element of the Battlefield experience in much greater detail, and that players had the freedom to put the story down and pick it up again after months of online play, without having to worry about who they were or what was going on. And it also managed to have the best rendition of the iconic Battlefield theme, which is an impressive feat in and of itself. But of course, the game was not an entirely unstoppable force. For one, the short story nature of its single-player campaigns meant that there was little in the way of narrative drive or characters to empathise with, which would have been a nice component to round off the experience. Furthermore, the online multiplayer has a number of promising areas that unfortunately and inevitably devolve into standoffs, where there are only really a couple of available routes, both of which are blocked off, which results in a stalemate that, whilst ironically representative of the trenches of the First World War, can easily leave what was an exciting and unpredictable match in something of a deadlock. The chaos can negate one of the Battlefield series' greatest strengths, the squads, by taking away that opportunity to silently form a tactical understanding with a group of complete strangers, coordinating to benefit one another in a manner that you just don't get in other games. Sure, this still can happen, and the trade-off may be worth it at times, but ultimately Battlefield 1's greatest assets are never all that consistent, and it wouldn't feel right to hand it the title of the greatest AAA game of the 8th generation. 2019's Resident Evil 2 remake is a third-person action puzzle horror adventure game, which is a weird mix in and of itself, but stays about as true to the roots of the Resident Evil series as you could whilst entirely remaking a game from the ground up for a popular release in the late 2010s. It's a visual feast that also features great gunplay, and delves in and out of all-out horror with highly effective ease. The game is also rightly praised for its replayability, effectively having 4 main campaigns that, despite occupying the same spaces, mix it up through having different weapons and enemies in place each time, alongside numerous puzzles that just don't pop up in other playthroughs. The thrills created through throwing together different enemies that required different playstyles made for extreme tension and meant that you were never quite comfortable even in areas that you knew well. For instance, if Mr. X chases you into a hallway occupied by both zombies and lickers, you have enemies that require shooting, one that demands that you run, and another that necessitates slow movements and a lack of gunfire, creating high-tension scenarios that surpass most of what is available even in the best of the disparagingly named walking simulator horror games like Alien Isolation or some areas of Resident Evil 7. Unfortunately though, Capcom's beautifully presented Zombie-Pocalypse is not the perfect Resident Evil outing. Despite the aforementioned variety and tension, it becomes a lot easier to understand the shifting of enemy locations and the surprises that the game has in store for you once you come to understand that things only change once a puzzle is solved. Similarly, Mr. X can easily be staved off into the game's latter stages, then avoided with simple kiting as his insistence on slowly marching towards you gets the better of him. What's more, the puzzles can become irritating, not through complexity but through their insistence upon having the player navigate the same corridors again and again, creating certain sections of monotony that definitely put a stop to the non-stop terror of other moments and areas. Resident Evil 2 is a phenomenal game, but it often becomes a case of just running back and forth through a stunning yet stale set of environments as you face off against a slow-moving wall of grey zombies which certainly doesn't offer the same levels of fear that the game clearly strives for. Levels that it does achieve in part through its gorgeous cutscenes and the situations that we find ourselves in. It just doesn't share the consistency of Dishonored 2, and the discovery that it offers is so often out of necessity as you find yourself treading the same path again and again, even more often than I have repeated this point. So let's move on to the final challenger, and perhaps the game that I've seen awarded this title more commonly than any other, and that is The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. The Witcher 3 is a game so well received that for many it has come to define not only the series that it occupies, nor even simply the company who developed it, but the entire concept of AAA games coming out of Poland. It's an open world game with multiple maps in which every corner and every NPC seems to be part of some intricately told and emotionally complex story, each making up a small square of an enormous and enrapturing mural. It's beyond immersive and beyond enormous, and so easy to get lost in for hours and hours and hours and hours without ever feeling like you're repeating yourself or doing something that's not worthwhile, even without contributing to the main quest. As you may have guessed, I love it when games reward exploration, and although it achieves this through written logs and character interactions, rather than areas that require innovation to reach, The Witcher might still be on par with Dishonored for its ability to make players feel as though the detractions from the trodden path have led them to something interesting. The dialogue options and bartering abilities, alongside the rich character list, mean that the people of the game feel real, and thus that the conflict between the natural world and the invading monsters becomes a key point of genuine interest on the part of the player, who comes to understand so many different perspectives and gain a wider appreciation for the universally celebrated narrative as a result. I've barely scratched the surface, and I could go on for quite some time, because I do believe this to be the closest challenger, at least of the games that I've played. I mean, they came up with a whole other game which was also awesome for Pete's sake, but there are a few issues that stick out like sore thumbs in my personal opinion. The combat is mostly smooth, but can get rather monotonous, feeling like the same tactics and basic set of moves apply to practically every enemy, with the only real variation coming from the rare elemental foes who require a certain use of magic to be defeated. This repetition is a particular point of contention by comparison to Dishonored, where you can skirt around combat or engage it through a number of different means. The Witcher is also easy to feel detached from if you haven't played the previous games, or read the books, or watched the series, or seen the film, as there are a lot of references to lore and decisions that were established in the prior entries, which can alienate new players, a criticism that certainly applies to Wild Hunt given how well it outsold its predecessors. This undercuts a lot of the excellent work done in enhancing the emotional connections to the characters and story, meaning that the final game felt at times as though it couldn't be reliably invested in, particularly with the larger overarching main story, as it was a lot easier to relate to the simple plights of farmers and working folk who were suffering at the hands of a monster that had made its way into the area. It's such a close run thing, the battle between these two games, and I can't pretend to tell you what you should think. After all, if you've made it this far, you've heard a lot of discussion surrounding Dishonored 2, and I'm sure that most of you will already have come to your own conclusions regarding the answer to this conundrum. But, in my opinion, there's a clear answer to the question, is Dishonored 2 the best AAA game of the 8th generation? And that answer is... yeah. Thanks so much for watching this extra long and ultra predictable video. If you've made it this far, you deserve a gold star and a pat on the back, so go and give yourself one of those, I suppose. I am, of course, eager to read any responses that you might have, so please do comment any opinions that you may have on the video, or the best AAA game of the 8th generation, or even just my annoying voice, which I'm sure that we're both sick of by now, in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed the video, I would really appreciate a like to let me know, so that I can tell whether or not it's worth wasting a week or so making another video like this one in the future. Anyway, thanks again for sticking with me, and I hope to see you all next time.